Hi, Misha here, and recently Eaglemoss released another bonus special edition, the USS Valiant, which is the concept version of our favorite ship, the USS Defiant. Not, of course, the one from TOS, but Cisco's motherfucking pimp hand. A term that I'm glad to see is being used in multiple videos now because it was a hilarious thing when it was originally coined by, I think it was Laura Loaded if memory serves, but either way, very apt and fitting. Also, a good way to be demonetized, but who cares? So the Valiant's a concept of that from Eaglemoss. It's great. So I thought we would talk about kind of the evolution of the Defiant class because not only was it Starfleet's first warship, which is unique in and of itself in universe, in the real world, its evolution in design was unique. But first, this video is late because initially, Eaglemoss did not ship me the USS Valiant. They actually shipped me the USS Newton, which is rather confusing to me when I opened the package a month ago. And instead of getting a concept Defiant, I had a J.J. Abrams universe ship. They did a few of those recently. They did the USS Armstrong and the USS Mayflower, as well as the USS Newton, which were three ships from the little fleet that got owned over Vulcan and that we saw in the other Abrams movies, different ships, obviously. So they've done quite a few neat little bonus edition ships. But yeah, I was expecting a Defiant-esque ship, so you can imagine my surprise when I got a J.J. Abrams ship. And that was really interesting, trying to communicate the problem with customer service, because apparently now they're outsourcing everything to India or Malaysia. And I was trying to explain what happened, that I was shipped the wrong thing, and they kept apologizing for shipping delays because I think they kept thinking I was saying the order hadn't arrived yet. And I was trying to say, no, it arrived. I eventually just gave up, and I thought, well, what the hell. And then a couple of weeks later, I got another ship notice for yet another USS Valiant because the original ship notice said that. So I thought this time, well, let's see if it's another Newton or if they actually send me the right ship. And huzzah, they did. Therefore, we're doing this video. So with that, yeah, let's get into this really neat design. And hey, I guess if anyone wants a USS Newton, I got one, and I don't think I paid for it. I hope not. Hope they didn't double bill me. I should probably go check my credit card. Meet the USS Equinox, a Nova-class ship seen in the two-parter Voyager episode entitled Equinox. Wonder why. This was the end of Season 5, beginning of Season 6. And if you ever wondered why they introduced a new ship that seemed pretty well fleshed out just to be a guest ship, and why they didn't just do a pre-existing ship, well, the reason was the concept actually was done for the Defiant, although back then it was sometimes called the Pathfinder. So going back to Season 1 and Season 2 of DS9, they had runabouts, which I guess they felt were adequate. They were beefed up shuttle. They were either really big shuttles or really small starships. They had their own NCC numbers and their own names, but they had a lot of other things in common with the shuttle. You know the deal. If you don't, go watch Deep Space Nine, which I'm sure you've done, so never mind. But throughout Season 2, they teased a new adversary, the Dominion, which finally appeared in full, or at least mostly in full, in the last episode entitled Jem'Hadar. And they blew up a Galaxy-class starship. Now, for beginning of Season 3, they were going to introduce a new starship. Incidentally, this was the same time that Babylon 5 introduced the White Star class starship. Those two series have a lot of parallels, and sometimes maybe intentional, sometimes I think just accidental because, well, Yeah, life on the space station gets a little monotonous after a while. So they needed a new ship, a warship, if you will. And I remember when that was the talk of the town, back when magazines were the main thing, what Starlog and all that, and the whole kind of upcoming, hey, Deep Space Nine's getting a ship. And even back then, they mentioned the name Defiant kind of as an homage to the TOS episode, Tholian Web, one of the best in Season 3, heck, one of the best in all of Star Trek. But anywho, they didn't know what to do. And this general design, at least the concept, was the more conventional, with the nacelles laid out. But they, from the very beginning, wanted something that was more combat-oriented, more speed-oriented, hence the large nacelles, but also something that looked a little clunky, maybe hastily done, or just without a design cue for aesthetics. Yeah, something a little rough around the edges, which I think kind of explains why the Equinox is a little bit that way. You can also tell one of the big artifacts from this originally maybe being a warship is the way that the bridge is sunk in. And of course we have, again, like I said, large nacelles. We have what are either shuttle bays or large impulse back here. We've got kind of the cutout saucer. And yet we still have a deflector like the, old Galaxy or the Intrepid type. Of course, this wasn't exactly the concept back in 93, 94, but it gives you the rough idea. Now, back then, like I said, sometimes this was called the Pathfinder. Another early name for this new ship was to be the USS Valiant, a good name for a warship. But pretty quickly on, they decided they didn't want to go too much into the traditional Starfleet design. That was one of the benefits of DS9. They're able to kind of do their own thing and get away from the strictures a bit. So they wanted to do something a little more adventurous. Now, early on in this whole design concept thing, they considered just beefing up a runabout, or maybe runabouts, to be the special new warship. I considered grabbing the runabout model from Eaglemoss, but I think you know what it looks like. If not, hey, Google. But pretty quickly, after just a few design sketches and kind of realizing that this just wasn't practical, they decided, no, we want something more unique, more original, and just bigger, more menacing. And this concept here, this is the Peregrine class, sometimes called, or just the Starfleet fighter, sometimes the Maquis fighter, sometimes the Starfleet courier. Either way, pretty small little ship. Originally had a crew of 2, maybe could hold up to 6. But notice the kind of swept down wings, the front accoutrement here. Yeah. This had been designed earlier in Season 2, and it appeared as at least in concept, was going to be a Maquis ship or maybe a Mirror Universe vessel. And it would appear later in the show. Come on. So this was one of the earliest starting points after the runabout was ditched, and kind of at the same time they were considering the more traditional Pathfinder. But the idea was, well, we could just scale this up a bit more and make a kind of unique but still Starfleet-y starship out of this. And, yeah, you can kind of see the way it looks head on with the wings dipping down. Like I said, some stuff in the front. We've got some engines in the back. Now, they never considered making this the Defiant or Valiant as such, but it was a starting point and gets us directly into our new concept model today. And here we are, Eaglemoss's vision of the USS Valiant. This was pretty late in development. when they pretty well had the design worked out. One of the most revolutionary concepts at the time was to go away from the traditional nacelle and pylon arrangement to this style here. And I think you can kind of see the influence of the fighter, the Peregrine, whatever you'd like to call it. They just attach these blocky, stubby nacelles. And in the back, we have impulse drives and manifolds back here. We do have what is rudimentary a saucer in the center with the same kind of sunk down bridge from the Pathfinder, what would become the Nova. And it's mirrored on the bottom. And we have this pretty unique frontal deflector. Although with this one it's more integrated, but it's also a little larger with more of an overhang. And this has, if you notice, just quite a bit of stuff kind of coming off. We have these protrusions in the front. We have more going on with the nacelles. We've got the impulse engines kind of bulged out in the back. And the model is more of a Starfleet coloration. We have red nominal Bussard collectors, a little bit of blue for the engines, and then we have a little bit of red-orange for the impulse in the back. And if you're wondering how I know the colors, it's because I asked my wife before doing this video. So this was a pretty late concept when they had the general idea worked out, borrowing a bit from previous concept designs. And this was to be a very fast, a very aggressive ship. Really Starfleet's first warship, although at the time they labeled it as an escort ship. And as is famously known, work began either shortly before or shortly after the Battle of Wolf 359 in 2366, and would continue for a few years, but eventually being shelved after a not-so-successful shakedown cruise in 2368 or 2369 when Sisko left Utopia Planitia. So it was shelved for many years. It was built to fight the Borg. The Borg came early, as unwanted house guests are wont to do, and it was put away. And then it would first appear in Deep Space Nine in 2371. And then they would actually put the class into mass production. Now, like I said, originally this was to be the USS Valiant of the Valiant class, but because Voyager was launching in 1995, shortly after, only about a half year after this was to be introduced in DS9, they decided to change the name to Defiant, so there would not be any confusion with Voyager and Valiant. Makes sense, honestly, to have two V ships right around each other. I could understand. Some might criticize them for kind of thinking their audience is dumb, but I don't know. Seems fine enough. And Defiant's a good name. Now, interestingly, for a little time, the Defiant, USS Defiant, was actually still going to be the Valiant class. But this didn't last long. Also, they had some diagrams, MSDs, drawn up and used in the Deep Space Nine series that were actually patterned more off this than what we would finally get. So it was kind of shown on screen, this concept, at least in theory. And I guess it wasn't so far off from what we ended up with that it stood out like a sore thumb. So, yeah, it kind of pop up in background computerized displays from time to time. And, of course, we also know that there was the USS Valiant from the episode Valiant. The one that was crewed by Red Squad, all those cadets, and rather unwisely went up against the Dominion battleship and got destroyed with like 3 survivors. So the name Valiant would be used for another Defiant class ship later on in the show, showing that these were mass-produced, even though the start was not so auspicious. And of course, this is the concept, and we have the final design. And here we have the standard edition of the Defiant from Eaglemoss. Not surprisingly, one of the earliest ones in our collection. And we've had several other editions, including a Mirror Universe version. We've had even a cloaked version. But this is the original. We've had an XL version. And this is what we got in the show. Now, most of the changes, the design is pretty similar, frankly. But the changes were done to make it a little streamlined, to make it seem like it was a faster ship. As I said at the beginning, one of the notes for creating the Defiant was to make it a little clunky, maybe a little crude. But once they got into the design, they realized, we want it to look fast, sleek, and deadly. So they did away with some of the pods kind of hanging out in the front. They integrated the impulse engines more fully in the back. They actually made the nacelles maybe a little bulkier, but also a little bit sleeker. And they made the deflector a little smaller, but also kind of hanging off the front more. But they retained the central sphere, saucer shape. And while they gave it a little bit of a rise, the bridge is still kind of sunk down. Something kind of from the very beginning. And of course, this was our final design, first seen in The Search Part 1, and seen throughout DS9, seen a handful of times in Voyager, and even appeared a couple of times in Enterprise, and once, briefly, but famously, in the movies, First Contact, where it finally went up against the Borg in 2373. It's actually probably pretty fortuitous that Starfleet had a warship on the design board and even a prototype made because of the Dominion War, which kicked off just a couple of years later and proved to be a tough little ship for the war here. So here's the final design that you all know and love. So let's kind of compare them side by side. So here they are. In some ways, the concept is a little more Starfleet. In other ways, it's a little more radical. This is a bit more of a simple shape. I could imagine for the early CGI, the Defiant we got maybe was a little easier to render. I don't know. Both have noticeable weapons and placements. And again, they both have the deflector hanging out the front. Although it's more integrated on the concept, it's a little more, out there on the production model. In fact, it's said to be, of course we never saw this on the show, but it's said to be detachable and even launchable as kind of an emergency last-ditch projectile missile that can even be armed with photon or quantum torpedo warheads inside it. All in all, as we know, it's a pretty small ship. Because this is fiction, no one even really knows the size. The most common size estimates are between 120 meters, 130 meters, or up to 170 meters. But 170 meters would be pretty problematic considering that the original Enterprise was under 300 meters and the Motion Picture Enterprise was just at 300 meters. So that would make it more than half the length of the Enterprise, and considering how stocky it is, that would mean it was bigger than the saucer. So depth-wise, that just wouldn't work out. I tend to lean more towards the 120, 130 meter estimate because it's only said to have 4 decks, although a few times the script or even dialogue mentions a deck 5, kind of like the Sovereign either having 24 or 26 or heck even 29 decks. One of those things to deal with. What's a little more consistent, the weapons. We have 4 forward-facing pulse phaser cannon. But since those are really only good for attack, offense towards the front, it also has 3 more traditional beam phasers. These are good for defense, firing to the rear, or even maybe strafing bigger ships, since it is a pretty small ship. There's a little more flexibility, if not near as powerful. We also have a total of 6 torpedo tubes, ordnance tubes, 4 facing front, 2 facing rear. These can fire your standard photons. They can also fire the quantum torpedo, which was actually debuted both in the real world and in the universe with the Defiant class. It's famously quite powerful, although not the fastest ship. Maximum warp was 9, and if they really pushed it and diverted energy, maybe 9.5. Class 7 warp drive. Surprisingly, it does have a shuttle bay, or maybe shuttle bays. It seems like instead of having maybe a traditional bay, it has more like 3 shuttle docking ports or docking nooks. And it carries 2 small shuttle pods, typically type 18, and 1 larger shuttle, the type 10. Or, at least in one instance, it had a runabout docked on board. So, maybe possibly that's how that works. It also has cargo bays. Has a total crew of between 40 and 50, typically nominally around 45 to 47. And as we know, most of the crew had to double up 2 to bunk room, even officers, which I'm sure made for plenty of fun antics, including the time that Odo and Quark got to be roomies. That could have been a sitcom all its own. In fact, the only one who really had their own private room as a standard was the captain, but he didn't get off the hook because his quarters, which were on deck 1 next to the bridge, doubled as his ready room, so, meeting room. So hopefully he made his bed every morning and cleaned up after dinner. Cisco did. That was really about it on board, besides weapons control. In fact, even though they had a very small science station and it had an engineering station on the bridge, it actually had 2 fully equipped tactical stations, and it had a helm station and a central captain's chair. Surprisingly, no seat for a counselor. Kind of makes you wonder what Ezri Dax was doing on board the whole time. Maybe practicing battle skills. She probably could use it anyway. Had a small sick bay, small med bay. Also had a small science bay, which was often kind of doubled as a reconnaissance analysis bay. In fact, that was kind of the excuse for having scientific equipment on board, so this could act as an armed reconnaissance observation craft. It had a 2-level engineering room, and actually 3 decks were taken up by the oversized warp core in and of itself. And another major place on board, it had a mess hall towards the front on deck 2. Typically, it had 4 tables. They could seat 4 on stools because we're still doing the Spartan thing. More could be squeezed in if needed, tightly. And it had a hollow screen projector for doubling as a conference room, meeting room, planning room, what have you. Because almost everything did double duty. Of course, one of the few places on board that had really only one duty, transporter room. In fact, there were 2 transporter rooms, one on deck 1, one on deck 2. But since everything's smaller on the Defiant, they had smaller pads, typically only capable of 4 people each. No holodecks, no rec rooms as such. I guess you could run around the corridors. Had turbo lifts, although you kind of have to wonder why with only 4 decks. I think they could have managed without, but I guess there you go. And had a few cargo bays and other storage facilities. pretty darn Spartan. And that was something that was carried out from the concept to the final version. Not that I would ramble on here about it, just kind of giving you hopefully a look in comparison of both. So yeah, the Defiant. So what do I think about the Valiant concept, and any final other thoughts? Having watched DS9 since it first came out, first run, I've always been a fan, and it certainly was okay in the first couple of seasons, but I think most would agree that the introduction of the Defiant was the turning point for the series. If not that, maybe a season later with the introduction of the Defiant and Worf together, because yeah, either way, that was when things really started to get good and Cisco lost more hair. So I was always happy when they did the Defiant. After all, we've had a couple of concepts for the Voyager, so why not get a concept for the Defiant to make things more equal? And I was rather naturally bummed out when they initially screwed up my order and shipped me the wrong thing, but I was happy they corrected that and got me the right one. And this is, again, something that's pretty unique to Eaglemoss. I don't see any other, if any other, companies doing this vessel. If they do, it'd probably be in a calendar or something, just, 2D artwork, which, as you can imagine, doesn't do me a hell of a lot of good. So this is the only way I would really know what something like this looks like, to physically hold it. And that's what's neat. And I like the size of these. They're big enough to really feel it. It's, the size of my hand. In fact, I would say lately it seems like the Eaglemoss models, most of them anyway, have gotten a little bit bigger. I commented this on the Star Trek Online videos. Now looking at this, it's just a little bit bigger than the standard Defiant. Part of it is maybe it's just a flatter design, but it's also very metal. In fact, it's got a good bit of weight. This is all one big metal piece. The impulse engines are plastic, and the bottom hull, at least partially, is plastic. But then even this is actually metal, the deflector. So it has some good heft and weight to it, more than I expected. And it does fit on its stand quite well. So it hangs off in the back like our other Defiant. But my Defiant, at least, always just kind of wanted to slip off its stand. To date, no tragedies, but a couple of scares a few times. So yeah, thought we would do a nice long video kind of comparing these, talking about the design history both in universe and in our real world. Cool stuff. Not much out there on these. Now, of course, the Valiant we saw in the show was a standard Defiant class ship, but could have been this. You never know. So let me know what you think. Hopefully I got it on camera for you. As always, I do appreciate you tuning in, and if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.